Alright, this is about halfway into the chest vision exercises. I'm about a week in of the 2 weeks that De La Masa recommends. And here are the 4 pieces you're supposed to do it with. The rook. I do the knight second because that's the most annoying one. Bishop is about the same as the rook in terms of how annoying it is. And the queen's the easiest one, so I save that for last. And the way you rotate around is you just go on each square once, like that. I'm looking through the camera as I do this, so I could be messing things up. Is that right? Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you always turn on these darker squares here. You turn on the lighter squares here. And when I say turn, I mean you go from this direction to that direction, or from that direction to that direction. You always turn on this diagonal, and you always turn on this diagonal. So that's an easy. One of the things I had trouble with when I started was knowing what was the next square to do. So those are the heuristics I use. All right, so now first thing I do is skewer. So skewer, because it attacks the king, and then looks on the other side. Skewer, skewer, and then I look for forks. Now in this case, there's no way to fork them without getting captured immediately. So that one's done. Now this one, skewer, skewer, and I always hit it like this. When I started, I used to drag it, but now I hit it just out of, I guess, a way to hammer it into my brain that those are separate squares. So those are skewer, skewer, and then this time you can fork. You can fork here, and you can fork there. And it's the same with the knight. You can fork in that way with the knight, if you were to have a knight here. Okay, so that one is done, I believe. Go here, skewer, skewer, and there's no way to fork. Skewer, skewer, fork, fork. Skewer, skewer, skewer. No way to fork. Skewer, 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 skewer. And you can fork like this, and you can fork like that. Now, when I first started, I would say skewer, 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 fork, 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 and that just was exhausting, doing it all for all 4 pieces. So now I don't do that anymore, and I just think it mentally. So I'll stop doing that now. And I'll show you roughly how quick I've been able to get. Because when I started, I was pretty slow. I would have to seek very carefully. And now I'm pretty fast, or I'm faster. Now there's no way to skewer here. So this is the next thing I wanted to talk about, is how do you look for forks quickly? And what I found was that I start with the piece other than the king. And for each piece I look at the squares that it cannot attack. So the rook can attack these squares, but the rook cannot attack these diagonal squares, but it can be attacked from those diagonal squares by the queen. So these diagonal squares are the squares that you want to look at as potential squares where the queen could go. And you have to look at which of those squares also attacks the king. So if the queen is here, for example, the queen is attacking the rook, and the queen is also attacking the king. Now, if the queen is here, for example, the queen is also attacking the king and attacking the rook, but the king can immediately take the queen, and so this one would not count. So what I do to look for these things quickly is I usually just go counterclockwise, starting usually on the vertical and then going around like that. It's kind of arbitrary how you decide to do it, but I think it's having a systematic way of looking at all the different squares makes it a lot faster. So in this case, what I would do is I would start on this diagonal, and I would say, okay, this is a fork. There are no forks here that prevent the queen. So there's no way that the queen can attack the king from these squares without getting killed. And then you can fork here. So and what I do is I start towards the rook and I work out. So I start here and work out. I start here and I work out. I start here and I work out like that. And then I start here and I work out like that. So you can't fork there, but you can fork there. And no, no. So again, it's this and this. Right, next one. So you can put it here, and you can put it here. And and so normally I don't move the queen physically. I just look at it, look at the squares. But I'm just doing this to demonstrate what's going on in my head. There's no skewer. There's no way to hit them diagonally. So skewer, skewer. No skewer. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for them being on the same diagonal or same squares. I'm looking for a way to travel from this one to this one along a diagonal or along a horizontal or vertical. So no skewer. So I'm doing this along this dimension. And then I think it's clear what I'm doing. So this one's not, so it's only this one. So I'm going to start going a little bit quicker. Okay, switching hands to hold this thing. Okay, so no skewer. Okay, skewer. So I did those three. No way to fork, no skewer, you always turn on these darker diagonal. That's something I keep forgetting. No skewer and no fork in this case. No skewer, but and I'm sure I may be forgetting some at some point, but I hope over time I'm getting better. Okay. No skewer, no fork in this case. Okay. No skewer and no fork. And I don't always go counterclockwise. Sometimes I go clockwise. It really varies. I think as long as you have a systematic way of hitting all the potential squares you have to look at, you'll be fine. No skewer, no fork. Whoops. And it's harder doing this with the camera in your hand. It's a little distracting because I'm looking at the camera to make sure it's capturing the actual chessboard and it's not pointing at the ceiling. Alright, no skewer, no fork. So I'm normally a little bit faster than this. No skewer, no fork. No skewer, no fork. And no skewer, no fork. Okay, skewer. No skewer, no fork. I think I got the fork in this case, right? I think I got that fork. Keep forgetting. Sometimes I make moves and I don't even remember. Okay. Alright, this video is getting kind of long, so I think I may cut it short here. But it's the same I think, idea here. You can't fork the queen and the king. You can only skewer. So that's a good thing to know. The bishop acts basically the same as the rook. I believe it's a little harder to fork when it's closer to the king, but then it's about the same as the rook afterward. The knight is horrible. Oh man, this exercise really shows you how bad the knight is once the board opens up. It is so easy to fork. It can be forked both the way that the bishop can be forked, and it can be forked the way that the rook can be forked. So when you have the knight on the board, just as an example, if I put the knight here, the squares you check are, you first have to check all of the rook, or I guess these would be the bishop's weak squares. You have to check all of these squares. And then you also have to check the knight's weak, the rook's, sorry. So you check the bishop's weak squares, and then you check the rook's weak squares. And so it can just be forked over and over again. I'll just take this one as an example. So it can be skewered like this. It can be skewered like this. It can be forked like this. It can be forked like this. It can be forked like this. And it can be forked like this. So it's just, the knight is terrible once the board opens up. So the one thing this has made me realize is that it's worth trying to use the knight in the early game to trade for a higher value piece like the bishop, which is likely to, or the rook. Those two pieces are likely to become more valuable at the end of the game. So one thing I try to do is I try to set up a situation in which I can trade my knight for one of those two pieces, or even the queen, and then try to open up the board by trading pawns and trading other pieces. And then that way, my extra piece becomes an advantage. So yeah, the knight is very good when the board is packed, and just awful when the board is opened up. Sorry, I'm going to call that quits there. I'm going to continue with these exercises myself, but I won't record them because I don't think people will find it very interesting. So there we go.